Donald Trump made an appearance at the National Association of Black Journalists convention.
6 News' Taylor Johnson was the only Omaha journalist in the room during the Q&A and has more from Chicago.
I'm standing outside of the Grand Ballroom at the Hilton Chicago, where former President Trump came to address members of the National Association of Black Journalists during their convention. Hundreds of members lined up to hear the former president talk about his plans for the presidency and to also hear him address concerns related to the Black community. There were contentious moments during the Q&A, including when Trump was asked about past comments made toward Black journalists. He was also asked if he believed Vice President Kamala Harris was a DEI hire. He said he only knew her racial background as Indian until recently and that he did not know she was Black. The audience was not allowed to ask questions, but there were some signs of support of the former president in the room. He was also asked about his plans for handling inflation and his recent comments on granting police officers immunity. Another main topic revolved around his running mate, J.D. Vance. Trump talked about his admiration for Vance's educational background and family values.
I chose him because he's a very strong believer in work and the working man and woman, and especially the working man and woman who have been treated very unfairly, because you have many of them in this room.
Vice President Kamala Harris was also invited to speak. The National Association of Black Journalists says that they're in talks with her right now to potentially do a Q&A with the membership in September. On your side in Chicago, Taylor Johnson, 6 News.